Welcome, everyone. I'm Brad Green. I manage the AngularJS and Angular Dart projects here at Google. And thanks, everybody, for coming. It's great to see you. We've got a couple announcements before our main speaker tonight. I just wanted to, every month we do this. We talk about what's happened in the last month. We've picked up a lot of velocity on our releases, and I think that's continued. So on the AngularJS side, and if you've been following along, you know that there's two branches here. There's the 1.2 branch, where we are continuing support for IE8 for a while, but mostly we're just doing bug fixes there. We've done a bunch of bug fix releases in 1.2.10 through 1.2.16. The new features, however, are going into this beta channel, where we've done beta 2 through beta 5. This is not quite ready for primetime usage, but a lot of good things are going on in there. So if you see some features listed, those are going to be the things that are in the 1.3 release, and that they'll be available soon. One of the really cool things we think that's come in this is this debounce for ng model, and this thing called ng model options for performance optimization. There's support for doing things like deregistering your observer in compile, for import support of some new types like date time and those variations. $animate now supports different form field states, which is really cool. And then filter supports things for supports deeply nested predicate objects. And there's a bunch of different performance optimizations that have gone in as well. So many cool things coming down the pipe in 1.3. On the Angular Dart side, it's been seemingly a little slow, but what you're looking at is a major change in the way that we do compilation of our template. And you can look at this as super cool in Angular Dart if you like Dart. And you can also look at it as a preview of some of the things that are coming in Angular 2.0. And you can start using them now in the Dart branch. One of these things that's coming is this new thing called the tagging compiler, which isn't really a feature so much as it is a way for us to do better performance analysis, so that we can separate different phases very clearly, and we can let you guys know where you're spending time, and we can know where we're spending time in Angular. And these things will run faster. There's some new syntax for doing event connection to event through the templates that we're calling OnStar style events. So instead of things like ngClick and the like, you can just specify the name of the event that you want to connect to. We did a big blog post. I and the rest of the team, we put together our thoughts for what's coming down the pipe in 2.0. And if you haven't seen it, it's still out there. We keep updating it, and we will continue to update this as changes come. And if you've got questions or thoughts, this is the time to read it and help us guide the end result. And this is why we published this thing, that we talk about all the different things that we think 2.0 should be. Our principle is this is actually going to be something that you're going to have to do some rewriting of Angular, of your current Angular apps. And so we want to build the framework that you'll be willing to leave Angular for. We think it's going to be cool. A couple more mundane and current announcements, maybe not more mundane. I saw this really cool bit on top of Angular for doing hotkeys or shortcuts. And it's tied to your views, and you can automatically register and deregister things based on views swap in and out. It provides a nice little visual on-screen menu. So if you want to do hotkeys, and I think like really every application should, here's a nice module for you guys to check out. And actually, I like the URL or the GitHub URL there. Chief Fancy Pants, pretty cool. One last thing we've announced, or actually we didn't announce, but some good folks in Europe announced NG Europe. There's a conference going to go on this October on the 22nd and 23rd. If you'd like to join us in Paris, the tickets are on sale now. We would love to see you guys there. Thanks. If you guys want a URL to the slide deck, it's right up here. We're going to now have Matt come up. Where is Matt? Matt's here. Okay. Matt is going to talk to us about some learning, building an Angular app in GoInstant, about how you construct models and how you make them real time. I'll take it away, Matt.
Thank you. In the mothership. This is pretty cool. Google kind of has to be the mothership in our industry, though, right? So this isn't going to be too heavy. How many of you guys are familiar with right. You're going to be bored. I apologize. I apologize. So I'm going to tell you about the pursuit of the perfect model. We've been working on a project called GoAngular. I'll tell you about that a little bit later. But it basically all exists in that model, the M of MVC. And I just want to share some things that we learned kind of along the way. Share my bruises, as it were. First, I should tell you about myself. My name is Matt Creager. I and the guys in the back there, you can see them. They were hoping for beer. That's why they look all grumpy. But we hail from the east coast of Canada. That's far, far north. I was shoveling my driveway before I came out here. God, I love San Francisco and spring. It's pretty nice. My fiance sent me away with like one piece of advice. She always sends me away with this one piece of advice, which is to get a haircut. She tells me I look like an idiot. Go get a haircut. She's an accountant, and she's pretty cheap. They broke the mold when they made her. And my friends had warned me that it was like pretty expensive here. And I had this haircut right here. I don't know if this looks like a $140 haircut. This is a $140 haircut. So yeah, my jaw dropped when they told me that. And I was like, that includes like what? So I might actually have to stay here. So if you've got that instructor role, I may take you up on that. So I can never go home. So the first time I used Angular was at BlackBerry. I worked at BlackBerry about 2 years ago. And we were building these real-time analytics dashboards. And I wasn't really in the weeds of Angular at the time, but we were using models and we were dealing with like reasonably big data until I met this fine group of people at a hackathon. A couple of them, as I said, are sitting in the back. And they work, and now I work for a company called GoInstant. And GoInstant is a platform for building real-time collaborative applications. So you kind of throw away your server and you use GoInstant, and now you no longer need a backend. It focuses mostly on collaborative applications, and I'll kind of show you a sample of that. I originally thought they actually were going to want me to build something using reasonably large data. I refused to say big data. I said big data. I did it anyway. But in fact, this was the integration they wanted me to build. So what does this look like? I'll just show you kind of what it does to give you an idea. So this is the landing page. So you can check out goangular.org. It's on those little flyers and stuff that you have. But this is pretty much how it works. So this is a sample app. This is a chat application. It's kind of like the quintessential real-time app. And you can kind of see if we just pop it up in an incognito video or browser, and we type some messages in over here, and then we hit send, it will do nothing. Am I not connected to the Wi-Fi? There we go. And so you can see, and if I do something on the other side, same thing, pretty straightforward. And now it's timing out and it's removing them. So that's kind of the gist, and that's all I'm really going to tell you about GoAngular for now. So I was really excited about this because I'd only been working in enterprise. I'd only been working on closed source projects, and closed source projects are kind of boring. Open source is super fun, and I was really excited about this community. I thought it'd be super interesting. But you don't want to hear about me. You want to hear about your Angular application. And one of the coolest things about working on this open source application was I had tons and tons of people sending me their feedback. Usually, I took some bruises. I took some bruises along the way, and I'll tell you about that. But let me kind of walk you through how this is going to work. I've got a quick public service announcement. I'm going to tell you how to actually implement a model, and then I'll show you how to make it real time. And that's all we're going to talk about. Off to the races. So a quick prologue, just in case you're not familiar with MVC. MVC is just an architectural pattern that ascribes responsibilities to parts of that structure, parts of that architecture. It looks something like this. Probably all seen this a million times. But you have a user. He's interacting with the view. That's what your user's actually seeing and interacting with. You've got a controller. That's all about what your application does, its behavior. And then you have the model, and that's what your application is. It's all about application state. So here's the public service announcement. The model has just completely faded from our collective consciousness. Most of the feedback I got early on, in fact, I think I had over 100 emails, and they would send me code along with it. And out of those 100 emails, they were asking me about how they would implement GoAngular. Not a single application actually included a model. And I was pretty shocked at that point. And that really affected how I started to implement GoAngular. So I was kind of like, anything that I put on scope is a model. That was kind of like the gist I was getting when I joined the community. And I was like, okay, I'll go with it. I'll go with it. So this was my first attempt. Actually, I'm too embarrassed to show you this. I guess I have to show you this. So this is pretty dreadful, but you can see at the top we are including GoInstant as a dependency. And then we're bringing in the platform provider, so that's just like picking a RESTful resource similar to that. And then we bring in GoAngular, and we pass out scope. Yeah, I know, facepalm, that's a bad thing to do. We give it a namespace. That's not really a great idea either. And then you can see that like include to-dos. We're giving it an array of strings. Well, if anything that you put on scope is a model, I'm like, and they want to synchronize things on scope, I'll just synchronize anything that's on scope. Well, it turns out this is actually a really bad idea. It works really well in simple use cases. Like you can see if you just push a to-do into the scope.todos, we're going to send that off. So we're watching that. We're watching scope, and then we're sending that update out to your remote data store. And then the rest of the clients that are connected to that session are receiving that event, and we're updating their local resources. So it sounds good, but this has all kinds of problems. So first things first, your data is married to the lifecycle of a controller. So as soon as your application becomes complex, it all falls apart. It's self-obfuscating. I wrote that code. I have no idea what that does. You've got nothing to extend. You can't dive into this. You can't improve it. You've got no concept of hierarchy. And it goes directly to storage, which, yeah, okay, maybe that's performant, but like we should probably validate data as it goes in. So if it's on scope, it's a model. Yeah, not so much. But Angular is an MVC framework, and you can see the model there. And that's really the only thing that we're going to talk about today. We're just going to talk about the model. So the model, still pretty useful, still really worth having around. I can prove it to you. It gives you a convenient, consistent API for access and manipulation. It's your authority on state change. It's a home for business logic. It lets you encapsulate your data. We'll come back to that in a little bit. I guess it's JavaScript. But so all in all, Angular sings when it has a real model. And it leaves a footprint that you can see. This is a view. Yeah, this is a view with a solid foundation. And it's just about presentation and interaction. You can see I haven't even told you that unit's going to be one of the models we're playing with, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. But you can see that unit has some properties. It's got a name, it's got points, it's got cost, it's got a description. It has some methods on it to remove, for example. And we are changing it up a little bit when it's being presented. You've got a certain number of words that are being displayed in the description, but that's all about presentation. We're not actually changing the state of that description. We're just limiting the number of words that are displayed. And this is a controller with a solid foundation. And you can see it doesn't do very much. It just pulls in the units. There's not even any promises there. Literally, it's just dropping that onto units, and I'll show you how that's done in a few minutes. And then we have this edit unit method, and that's all about presentation. That's going to pop a modal up, and then it's going to pass that unit into the edit modal method. And now that edit modal method has everything that it needs. It's got that unit, so it has access to that data. So how do you actually go about doing this? Well, it turns out it's pretty simple. Does anyone play Warhammer? Sorry, let me rephrase that. Is anyone willing to publicly admit to playing Warhammer? Yeah, me too. I got in trouble for that too. Well, it turns out I'm terrible at painting these little miniatures and terrible at putting them together, but somehow I've managed to pull it together, and I kind of like it. So I thought instead of dealing with a to-do app, we'd use this as a frame of reference. I guess we can close this now. Close that too. So this is what we're going to be looking at. This is a roster builder. So those are some units on the left. You can see like that handsome Grimgor Ironhide there. He's a single unit. And then you've got like a roster on the right. And you know, you might have guessed that like if you click things, you add the units and it adds the points up and keeps track of them. So that's all it's doing. That gives you a bit of a frame of reference. There we go. So the first thing you're going to do is you need to find your model. You need to define it. And this actually turns out to be pretty simple because it tends to be how we think. I mean, I'd like to hear somebody break up Warhammer into anything except for a unit and a roster. It kind of makes sense. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to express your model, but do it before you implement it. So let's describe a roster for a moment. It's going to have a certain type, Space Marines, Beastmen. I'm building an orc army. It contains units, obviously, and those units are going to be the same type as the roster. So we're talking about relationships here. And it's got a total limited number of points. It can't have more than X units, et cetera, et cetera. And then the next thing you're going to do is going to give it a home. So I'm not sure if you guys have seen this yet. I think this was announced pretty recently, but this is kind of the prescribed structure for an Angular application. And it's pretty different. You've got index and your app.js and your app.css, all at the top level. And this works really well for a model because it's obviously going to sit in your components. Each of those directories is going to include your model, it's going to include tests, and it's going to include a few other files that we'll talk about in a few minutes, but pretty straightforward. And they've promised that they'll build us some nice automated tools if we use this proposed structure, so that's another good reason. It's also really practical because if I'm working on an application, I tend to work on one component at a time. I usually screw that part up before I move on to another part. And it's how we version control. If you're going to rip a component out, it's nice if it's already all bundled up for you. And of course, it's how you think. So implementation, what does this look like? Well, if you pull all of the logic out of your controllers and your views, then all you end up with is this really bloated model. So that's not really a good way to approach it. What's a better way? Let's look at some code. Apparently, I can't look down and breathe. It's going to be hard to type. So I kind of like to start in the view and then work back. We'll go through the controller. We'll look at the model quickly, look at the resource. So this is includes classes and stuff. This is our list of units. And you can see that we're just repeating through units. We've got images, we've got names, the stuff that you kind of already seen before. It's got a cost and its currency. So if you were looking at this, this is what it would look like here. And then we have a controller. The controller isn't doing very much. You can see that we're just doing a unit.find, and you might notice that that's actually happening on the constructor, and I'll show you why in a couple of minutes. But let's look at what that's actually logging out. So we have an object, and you can see that at the point that it's at right now, it already has an ID. It's got a count, description, image, and if we look at the prototype, it's got an omit method and an unwrap method, which I'll show you what those do in a couple of minutes. That. Whoops. Where did my code go? There we go. So this is the model. I mean, this is kind of the thing that you're pulling into your controller. This is the very unit that you see here. So we're dropping it in, we're requiring it, we're prefixing it with BD. That's a good convention. And then we are calling the find method, and we're dropping that right onto scope.units. So you can already see that in the constructor, we're taking future unit data. And what's cool about this is a good model should be able to accept either data or a promise. It shouldn't matter which one it gets. After it gets it, you obviously, if it's already data, you're going to just extend it. If it's a promise, you can, if you'd like to, call unwrap right away. And I'll show you what an unwrap function looks like a little bit later. But needless to say, this isn't in core anymore, and it serves. It's nice if you implement it yourself in the model. It really belongs in the model. Next thing we have is a factory. And I'm defining this on the constructor because if you use something like Browserify, I'm not sure how many of you use Browserify, it's nice to package everything up into one object and export it. It makes it really easy to test. And then you just handle the registration separately. So not something that you need to do. You could, of course, pass these dependencies into the constructor, but it works well this way. And then we have the find method. And you can see that's dipping into a resource, which is being defined here. And I'll show you that in just a second. But the important thing to note here is that we're not accessing this data directly from the model. We have a separate service that's handling that. And really, that's all there is to the unit. I mean, this isn't difficult. And if we look at the resource, this is sitting on top of deployed. I'll show you that in just a moment. But all we're doing here is we're pulling in HTTP as a dependency in the same way. So we have a factory, we list it as a dependency, and at the point at which we construct it, we actually pass it in because we want each instance to have access to those. And then the find method just creates, I use the big Q defer, you could use little q, but we create a promise, and that's resolved if the request is successful or rejected if there's an error, and then we return that promise to the model. So that's what the model's taking in. So let's flip over to, there we go. Oh. That's easy. So that's kind of every layer of the model. And it's so simple to implement. And that's kind of the point, is how simple this is to implement and how simple it is to implement well. The factory, you only really need that if your logic becomes complex, and that does tend to happen. Your data management, that's just an API that abstracts you away from accessing local storage or WebSockets or an API. And there's obviously some kind of known issues with this. I mean, this presentation was all about the feedback I was getting about GoAngular, and you saw that initial version. And it's all about what happened between the version 1 and version 3. Well, most of the questions I got when I started moving people from keeping their models on scope to actually defining them separately, and this kind of sums it up. So the first thing is JavaScript is asynchronous. Yeah, that does make sense. It is asynchronous. Automatic promise unwrapping is out. I mentioned that. But you can just implement it on your own. And you know what? That makes a lot more sense because it really belongs on the model anyway. You always want to return an object and populate it later. This is something that people seem to have a hard time comprehending when I first started showing them to it. But as soon as they realize that you can pass it to Angular and Angular is going to do the rest of it for you, that's really nice. So this is what an unwrapped method looks like. It's really straightforward. You just make sure that you expose. So this is the actual unit. And you make sure that you expose that promise to them so they can use it too if they'd like to. And then you, after the promise has been resolved, you apply it using timeout. Now, timeout just means that you don't actually have to take in scope to call apply. So after the timeout's done, the view is going to be updated. That's kind of a neat little trick. Inheritance in JavaScript is always kind of a sore topic, but it's really hard to avoid when you're talking about models because models are all about inheritance. You often end up in these use cases, 83.763%. I measured that with a thermometer. You've got a key, which is inherited from a model, and a user, which is inherited, or sorry, a user, which is also inherited from this base model, and then an admin, which is inherited from the user. So these are like really common use cases you see all the time with models. Honestly, this is like, do you guys shop at Costco? Do we have Costco here? No, no Costco. Oh, my Lord. Well, we do have Costco here. Thank you. It's a funny trick. Yeah, so we have Costco back home as well. I know because I see them on my Visa bills. And you know, one thing that Costco does really well is when you go shopping in Costco, they only have like a limited number of items on the shelf. And that's the problem, I think, with JavaScript inheritance. Is like there's so many ways to implement it, you just don't end up implementing it at all. That's kind of a mistake. I think parasitic combination inheritance, even though it's a crazy term, I wanted to put like an image of a parasite here. I Google parasites, that turns out it's a bad idea. Don't do that. That'll scare you. So, I mean, it's really this easy. You're just going to copy over the prototype and then redirect the constructor. And I mean, there's a million of these function out there. If you Google inherit prototype, you'll see it everywhere. We also use this in GoAngular. You can pretty much reverse engineer the GoAngular and you'll find all this stuff. And this is how it's actually used in a model. So we apply the arguments to the constructor, the parent constructor, and then inherit the prototype down there at the bottom. So pretty straightforward. The other thing that you see a lot in a model is bloat around validation. That's actually kind of a solved problem. If you look up specifications, specifications are like a really simple concept where you basically just pull your validation out, you put it into a specification, which maybe you could share on the server and on the client. And as long as your model is always in a valid state, it's totally acceptable to pull that stuff out of your model. And encapsulation. This is JavaScript. So we do encapsulation with an underscore or 2 $signs. I know that kind of sucks, and if you want something better, you can look up safe proxies. Safe proxies is an alternative. It just ends up being a little bit slower. But I think the underscore works. So talking about conventions, it's also kind of a good practice to follow conventions. Get, set, on, off, extend, initialize, sync, key child. These are all kind of standard methods that you see in models across libraries and languages. They're very standard. You should use them. So how do you make it real time? Well, isn't that the question? I think a lot of people, when real time became a big thing, is everybody familiar with real time, what real time is all about? You saw that chat app. They wanted to like throw out the model because they thought, you know what, we need a different vehicle. But it turns out the model can be easily extended. Okay. I'll show you how this works. This is going to include a little bit of live code. So let's hope that works. All right, so we have this like button. You can see it doesn't really do anything right now. I'm pretty bad at building a roster, so I need some help. I want to invite somebody in and have them offer me some suggestions. It's that simple. Slightly contrived example, but it'll work out. I really do need the help, though. So the first thing we need to do is just, and I've already done this for us, you need to include a link to your whatever real-time database you're using. So whether it's WebSockets, here I'm using GoInstant's platform, obviously, but whatever real-time system you like to use. And then you include GoAngular as a library. And obviously, this comes default connected to platform. And then in our app.js, obviously, we need to indicate that we need that library. Whoops, that's not English. And then configure it. I feel like somebody right now is just devastated that I'm prefixing everything with $signs. So the reason that I'm prefixing everything with $signs, and you might have noticed that, is because when you pass a model to a view with a $sign on it, all that stuff's just stripped out for you. So that's kind of a nifty little trick. I told Jeff, he didn't seem very happy about it. It's an undocumented feature. Use it at your own risk. So we will call set on this, and we're just going to give this URL. And if you are using GoInstant, you get to this stuff by just going to your applications. This is on your dashboard, and this is an app that we created. We could have created another one here. And once you've got it created, you get this connect URL. And if you copy that over, oh, whoops, what did I do? Copy that over. So it's not connected yet. It doesn't actually connect until you require GoAngular as a dependency in one of your controllers. So let's do that. So we're gonna, we'll create a separate model, and we'll bring it in. Oops. Yep. And we'll call this BD suggestions. And so we'll just specify Go key. So all of the methods in GoAngular are also prefixed with Go. It's just a good practice. And now let's just have a look at this. So you might have guessed what this is. This is just a factory, and it's going to produce models. So is that all going to work? We'll find out. Okay. So before I show you that, we just actually need to include BD suggestions in. Well, a roster is going to have suggestions. So we have like a one-to-many relationship there. So let's express that by dropping into the roster model. So we're going to extend this roster model. Just going to include BD suggestions, which we just created. And let's call it suggestions. Go. So now we're just going to extend the constructor so it actually has access to it. And at this point, we should, so you can see that this is a constructor. All it's doing, and it's kind of, well, maybe it's not too difficult to see. All it's doing is it's taking in arguments, validating them, and then returning a model. That's literally all it does. So it's super straightforward. Next thing we need to do is just actually drop those suggestions onto, and we're not going to prefix it with a $sign because this is data. This isn't a method, so it needs access to it in the view. And I'll show you that view in just a sec. So we're going to go roster.suggestions.sync. And sync has kind of become the convention in all the real-time APIs. It basically means anytime your data changes remotely, we're going to update it locally. But if you want it updated remotely, you need to actually call set, or something like that, add, whatever else. So pretty straightforward. All right. So let's just, roster.suggestions. Did I call it something else? Yeah, I prefixed it there. Why work? I think I have to restart it. Oh, I see why. We didn't actually return anything. Classic. So we might as well point it at a RESTful resource right now. And there we go. So you can see that this already actually does contain some data. So I was playing around with it a little bit earlier. And at the point at which we're logging it out, all it has is future unit data. But at the point that it's being displayed in the view, we have all of these units. So they're already on that object. And you can see that on the right-hand side here, they're here. And if we go back to the app here, so this is a data inspector. And just show you how I got to that, I just clicked on Builder. Pretty straightforward. And you can see if we look at the suggestions, we have these suggestions here. So let's add a suggestion, just to make sure it's actually working. Now, if you're thinking that this feature required too little code to be realistic, that was all of the code I wrote. That was legitimately it. So it inherited that base model. I had all of those methods in place, and it just works out of the box. I wasn't doing anything else. There's no other magic underlying that. Let's just erase this, or clear this suggestions out. All right. And now we probably should pop 2 of these up. Kill these 2. Oh. Why work? Okay, let's look at the log. Back in. Oh, so this is going to be pretty straightforward. The only thing we need to do is actually implement a method on the roster prototype to add that, which makes sense. I left myself a reminder and then completely ignored it. So this is just going to take in a unit. So I guess I was kind of lying when I said that was all the code we needed. We actually needed a bit more code. We'll return something. Let's return, so we have this dot suggestions. So that suggestions is a collection. And if we just access a key on that, we've already got a key. We'll just use the unit ID. And we'll call set. So we're accessing that specific unit in that collection. And we'll call set, and we'll call omit, which just cleans anything prefixed with a $sign off of it. Okay, cross your fingers for me. If this doesn't work, I'm bouncing out that exit behind me. I scoped that out as soon as I walked in the door. So there you can see the suggestions are in place. They're on this client, and they're on the other client. So all the clients connected to that session are seeing those suggestions pop up. Pop up another one. So that really is all the code that we needed, I promise. Very straightforward. Oops. All right. I thought I had this open somewhere else, actually. There it is. Oh, no, that's not it. There we go. So just a quick refresher of how that works behind the scenes, because it's really not doing very much. This is a super simple thing. You only really require two things. You need events and context. So you have a bunch of clients. They're all connected to the same session. Whenever one of them does a set, performs a set, that event is going to be sent to all of the connected clients, and it needs specific things in context. The events that you need, just a bare minimum, are a set, so you know when the data is changing, an add, so you know if something's being added, and a remove, so you know if something's being removed. And this is a sample context. This is what you would see if you looked at the context in GoAngular. You can see that I know what the command is. I know which key it is and where it's happening. I know what the new value is. I know the user that it came from. I also know the position, so just in case it's changing. And I know if there's a batch of events coming all at the same time, because each event should only represent one action. So I know if there's a batch of events, I can kind of like queue them up and do them all together. The initializing fetch, this is just the first time that you do the request and then return a model. As soon as you do that, you unwrap the promise, and as soon as it's resolved. And that's it. Angular takes care of the rest. So implementing, it turns out, as it happens, that implementing something like a real-time model in Angular is really simple as long as people use models. If they don't use models, it's really, really, really difficult. The last thing you can do, if you absolutely have to, this is something that like people requested a lot early on, and so you can imagine that if you can track changes remotely and then update local, you can track changes locally and update them remotely. But it turns out in Vern this is a really bad idea because you'll lose your error locality, it'll affect your performance, and eventually your sanity. But if you have to do this, then you watch the local model, so you're watching it on scope, you're calculating the diff, what is it now, what was it before, and then you're pushing those changes upstream. If you're going to do this, you need an audit log. An audit log is really simple. You're just keeping track of all of the transactions on all of the clients, so when stuff gets screwed up, and I promise you it will eventually get screwed up, you know why. So in conclusion, like, what did we learn building GoAngular? Well, I cannot tell you that we found the perfect model, but the pursuit of perfection is all that really matters. And we learned a lot about what this community is letting go. And I think what this community needs to do, I was talking to Jeff about this earlier. What makes Angular so cool is you take people that are finding JavaScript, maybe through design. I know that this was originally something that was developed for designers. And you introduce them to these like core engineering concepts. But if we just let something like the model slip away, I mean, this is like foundational, it's a problem. Implementing your own model is totally worth the effort. You should 100% do it. Real time, it makes for unbelievable user experiences, and we don't need anything new. You can do it with the model as it exists today. It just needs a few new tricks. You'll know you're getting it right when your models are easy to unit integration test, they're easy to extend, they're portable, meaning you can use them on the server and on the client. Your controllers and your views are thin, and you just have that feeling that everything has a place. That's really an important part. You can find all these examples at Matt Creager /talks/real-time Angular model. I know I kind of blew through some of that code. You can find GoAngular at GoInstant GoAngular. It's an open source project, as I said, or goinstant.org. And if you really, really needed to do example, there's one of those as well. Questions? I think actually, do we save questions for the end? We do save questions for the end. Thank you so much for your time, guys. I really appreciate you having me here.
Brian, please approach the stage. All right, our very own Brian Ford is gonna.
Brian, wait.
Sorry, oh yeah, Brian needs a mic. So Brian's gonna talk about using Angular with very large data sets and what to do when you've got a ton of data that you want to display. It's gonna be a little short, but it's gonna be super tasty. Brian, take it away.
Yeah, just unplug that. Thanks. All right, so as Brad said, this is going to be a really short talk. My slides are just a README file on GitHub. The URL is github.com/bt_brian-talks-about-angular-with-lots-of data. Okay, so this is pretty short and sweet. So I'm going to start with just a simplified explanation of how digest works, and then based on like this general concept, how you can apply it when you're building an app that has like some array that has millions of rows. So first, I have this obligatory thing that I'm supposed to tell you that you should measure things if you're worried about performance. There are lots of tools, lots of great articles that explain how to use these tools. Chrome has this awesome thing built in where you can see all these different events and like track things and see what it's doing. I'm not going to talk about that, but you should definitely go read about it. All right, so what causes slowness? There's a couple different things, but there's like DOM manipulations, which cause reflows, which is where the browser has to kind of recalculate where different parts of the page should go. There's lots of strategies for like reducing reflows and for working with the DOM quickly, like using CSS classes instead of changing properties of elements. But Angular is pretty good at helping you do the right thing with this. Like for instance, animations gives you classes as hooks. So you're kind of set up out of the box to do the right thing there. The thing that you should kind of be concerned about is how many dynamic things does Angular have to keep track of? And really this is called the number of watches, or the API is $scope $watch. Okay, so what we really want to do is think about how we can reason about these things. So what actually causes Angular to watch something? Let's like look at an app here. So we have this interpolation in the double curlies here. So we're watching some property of the scope called thing. We have getThing, which is a function that we're invoking. And we have ngRepeat with some binding inside of here. So here's like some pseudocode that approximately represents what Angular is going to be watching every time. So we have one thing for this property thing. We have one watch for getThing. So it's important to note that anytime Angular thinks something has changed, it has to invoke this function again. From ngRepeat itself, we need the number of items in this items array. So we need the length of it. And then we need object references from each object in there. Then inside of the ngRepeat, we also need to look at the name for each item that we're repeating over. All right, so how does the digest cycle work? So this is like a gross oversimplification. There's documentation on the Angular site that you can go through that explains a lot more about scopes. And you can also actually read the source code. Like it's not actually that scary if you look at the source code for scope. But the basic idea is that Angular keeps track of what values were before something like a click or a HTTP request comes back. And then when there's an action that might have changed the state of the application, it runs this digest function that figures out for each of these things that we're watching, did it change? If it changed, then we need to keep track of it for next time, but then we also have to trigger all of the things that we're watching. And then if there were changes, these $watches might trigger additional changes, so we actually have to go back to the start and do all of it again. Okay. So I mentioned this before, but every time we have to evaluate this getThing function that we were listening to up here. So if that's slow, then all of your digests are going to be slow. Similarly, if you have a bunch of things in the array, like if this ngRepeat that we had up here was 1 million lines long, then you'd have 2 million things in here because you have to check the reference for it, and you also have to check each of the things inside there. Right? Imagine we had item.price or something like that. Then we would have 3 million things in here that we'd have to look through. So the short version is watch fewer things and keep the function, or keep function invocations out of there, right? Or if you are doing them, make sure that they're fast functions. All right. So how can you reduce expensive watches? So the easiest way is you transform the data before you bind to it. So we can imagine an app here that makes an HTTP request. It comes back, we set data to the scope, and then we have some helper here that like formats the data. And then in our HTML, we're doing something like this. So we call this transform function that somehow formats the item name. And this is bad because it means we're calling this transform function on every single digest. Let's see how we could improve this. So instead of calling it here in the template, we can move it over here inside of the success handler for this HTTP request. So what happens is the data comes back from the server, we transform all of it immediately, and then Angular doesn't have to run this function every single time on the digest. Okay, so the next part, this is a little bit harder perhaps, is how to watch fewer things. So one of them is you split things up into pages, right? So you have some big array that has 1 million things, but you slice it into groups of 5 or something based on different UI considerations. Most of the time, you're not dealing with huge screens, so your user can only see a portion of it. There are a bunch of modules and directives and things that let you do infinite or virtual scrolling with the same idea. So you can check this out. If you know that the data comes back from your server and it's only populated once, there's no reason to be watching it every single time. So there's an open GitHub issue here that's actually assigned to Igor. So Igor is sitting back there. You can bug him about getting this done faster because it looks like he's slacking. But there are a bunch of third-party modules that also implement this feature that says, just wait for the data to come, put it in the template, and then don't watch it anymore. So that's really good. You can imagine cases where you need to load in a table, but that table isn't changing a bunch after this first time. And then there's another case where you know that the data is only populated on very certain times. So this is almost opting out of data binding altogether, but you can write something like a directive that does some custom DOM manipulation, and then you can use scope broadcast and scope on to kind of take control of when this gets rendered yourself. This is kind of like a last resort, but it's nice that Angular makes most cases really fast, but then also lets you kind of take control of performance when you need to. And that's about it. Again, it's on GitHub. Apparently it's under an MIT license, so you can like fork it and stuff. Right. That's it. That's all I have.
Woohoo! Okay. Questions. Matt, if you want to come back up here, that'd be great. And the rest of the crew is around for questions as well. But let's primarily focus on these guys, and the rest of you can have questions with us later. One announcement before you get going with questions. If you do, Christina's going to give you a form to sign saying that I'm okay with my question being broadcast on YouTube. And she'll also give you a t-shirt, is that correct? Yes. Also, when you leave, there's a lot of food left. There's to-go boxes. Please take some. It's within the boundaries of what we like. So, all right. And I'll give Matt the microphone. Please answer some questions.
So this is live. My fiance is going to hear that comment I made.
When you ask a question, please ask it through a microphone. We'll go right here first.
Can you compare Firebase with GoInstant?
Knew I was going to get that question. I knew it. So I think there's definitely room in the industry for lots of players. It's huge, and neither is necessarily better. But to compare them, I would say in the early days, we both had a lot of the same growing pains. I'm sure they were looking at the issues in GoAngular, and I was looking at the issues in Firebase, and we were both trying to keep in sync. So in terms of what you'll use in Angular, there's not really a lot of differences between the two APIs. It's going to come down to the preference at the lower level if you actually need to dip into that, because they're very, very similar right now. We've kind of converged on not the perfect model, but something that really does work. I doubt your question. I'm sorry.
Okay, question here.
Hi, I have a question about the real time. In your example, imagine I want to filter all the goblins, sort them by amount of points they're worth, and display the top 5. How do I do that?
So you want to, sorry, can you just repeat that one more time? What does he want to do? You want to?
I want to filter, then sort, and then paginate.
Okay, so I think one of the things you might be indicating is that you're storing each of those units on the object itself. So the first thing you need to do is you need to convert it to an array, and a filter is a really easy way of doing that. And if you want to make it performant, you separate out.
No. It was about the real time thing. Like
Yeah. So we're in the real-time API. Yeah. So you'd use filters. You just use Angular filters, and the only thing that's going to prevent you from using an Angular filter is that they're actually stored on that object. So you need to keep the positions separately in an index, and then have the filter convert it to an array with the positions in place. So you can see that.
What if I have too many? Let's say I have 2 billion records, and I only need top 5. How does?
So I would say you probably don't want to make a request for 2 billion records. You'd probably only want to make a request, like you'd want to change the way that find works and resource works to only pull a certain number down, or you could change resource so that it pulled them down one at a time, a batch at a time, 10 at a time if you needed to.
But how do I keep them real time? If, for example, I display top 5, then someone edits number of points. It was 1,000, it puts it minus 1,000. Then this record immediately should go down to the bottom of the rank list, right?
Yeah, so in GoInstant, we handle that at a lower level. So we're caching them on the client, and we're saying, like, has the result of the query changed? And if so, do they need to have a different selection of units on that object? So the object is always going to contain the units that are relevant for your query, but the positions might change. And if the positions change, you need to use a filter, because otherwise there's no other way to sort them.
Okay, thanks.
Cool. I'm going to run across the room.
This is a question about large data sets. As far as returning data and slicing it up, as you said with pagination, is it performance considerations doing it on the server side, and as opposed to doing it in one call at first and then slicing it up? In essence, is more multiple network calls better, or one single call and manipulating?
That's a good question. I would say, like everything, it kind of depends. So network calls are usually more expensive on mobile. So like it might be advantageous to download the whole thing right away. Like making lots of little requests on mobile tends to be expensive, right? But if you have an enormous data set, then obviously you can't download all of that as well. So you really have to batch it. So I would say it really depends. Like there are trade-offs. It's network latency, and then you have to manage some complexity in your like model code that understands how to do this. It really depends. Do you have a specific case in mind? Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. So to reiterate, just is there a pattern that's good that allows you to choose different strategies? So I don't have one off the top of my head. There's nothing that would stop you from writing something like that.
I think Brian's saying test your results.
Yeah, let me know. Let me know how it goes. Thanks.
So I had a question. How would you compare GoAngular to a solution like Firebase, and how would they contrast? Because they're both like live synchronized?
You didn't like my first answer, did you?
Oh, really? Sorry, I completely missed that one.
Okay, good.
I
All right.
legitimately put him to sleep during that answer.
Okay, question here.
You said that model is always valid. So we don't put their data until it's valid. But how to do when data is not complete? For example, user is filling registering form, and he must fill first name and last name. But when first name is filled, model is not valid. How to put data there?
So, I mean, that's a good opportunity to leverage your controller. I mean, that should really be sitting in your controller until you pass it to the model.
So you are populating data in the model once form is valid.
Yeah, because so you're validating that, and that's kind of like a dicey point. I actually had a slide for that I pulled out because I wasn't sure how to describe it. But there is definitely some stuff that you're going to validate at the point at which they're entering it because you want them to have that instant feedback. And on the other side of the fence, you've got promises that could potentially be rejected at a later point. So for example, you do the initialize, you look at the data that comes down, you validate it, you realize that it isn't valid, and now you have to reject the promise. But you've already given them that original object. So there is some kind of tricky edge cases that you end up in. That's a good question.
Okay, over here.
Hi, in the wake of Windows XP being discontinued and IE6 finally dying, I was wondering if you guys have any insights on how ECMAScript 6 is coming along, and whether you have any tips on where to stay updated on what the progress is and when the launch is, because I, like many others, are probably pretty excited about ECMAScript 6 and future of Chrome and Angular 2.0.
Am I still projecting somewhere? Is there? You know how to work this thing? That's embarrassing. All right. Okay. So I like this website. So can I use? So this is great for individual things. Let me see. I know we had somewhere.
Actually, we linked to it from the Angular 2.0 blog post.
Yeah.
There's a nice site that shows you which features are already in which browsers, and including the one that you're browsing in. Yeah, it's a nice table there.
Yeah. So yeah, check it out on the Angular blog. We describe it here in this post. Great question though, and something we're really looking forward to.
Here too.
More questions for these guys. Back here. Okay.
So I think that my questions goes to the point that he raised it. In Java, I usually use for my models what's called builder pattern. So have you considered using builder pattern for your models? What is like, we would have a builder inside of your unit, and you receive all your params, like first name, last name, and you would have a is valid in your controller, which is going to be watching for until the unit is valid. And then when the unit is valid, then you return that object as a broadcast. I'm not sure if it makes sense or not. Just want to point out.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. So you picture that happening in your constructor at the point at which they construct, it does the validation, and it just continuously rejects it until it's actually a valid object. Yeah, that could work.
Cool. Maybe one more question, if we have one. Once, twice. Okay, thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming. We'll see you next month.